people to identify 45 potential neighborhoods in South Burlington. And the experience that Paul Ingalls and I had on the Chamberlain Task Force was great, because now there's an activated group there that's wanting to stay in touch with us. I've also since talked to a couple of other peoples in neighborhoods, and what seems to be pretty clear to me is that in a lot of neighborhoods, there's already kind of a known captain or busybody, like I defined myself. So the point is, the comp plan takes place over 3 years, and Paul and I discussed the idea of going ahead and dividing up, even if it's those 45, among all of us in some manner, so that across the next 2 years, even if we each had a couple of neighborhoods that we were, responsible for knowing more about, it actually is less daunting than it might be. So I just wanted to let you know that there is interest from the Chamberlain Task Force. They actually wanted Paul and I to sit in on a conversation tomorrow asking us about the comp plan. And I feel it's better if we all discuss what would be shared with neighborhoods so that they're getting the same information, and maybe discuss how to break down that responsibility, share it a little bit. I have some ideas for how we could do that, and I'm happy to help get it organized. So anyway, I just wanted to put that out there. And I think that Paul and I are sitting in on a Zoom tomorrow, but really more as a listening session, I think. And I don't even know what we'd explain yet in terms of details about the comp plan, other than we'll keep you posted on how you can get involved.
Yeah, I think that group doesn't have any great understanding of the comp plan.
Mhm.
Really tell them that it's, February 2020.
Mhm. But I think that it will be easier than we might think to actually connect with captains of neighborhoods, and then kind of divide and conquer among ourselves, and, not putting a lot of work on people's plates, but it could be cool. So I'm announcing that Paul and I might go to this thing tomorrow to listen on a Zoom. But then I guess I'd ask if you guys like the idea, we can discuss it in the future meeting, and I can, and Paul and I can present ideas for what it might look like if we all divide and conquer that.
The person who organized this is Ashley Adams, who one of the leaders of the Chamberlain neighborhood. She lives across the street from the 11 acres that she has a couple of homes that she owns that she also.
Would we give them more credibility if we actually asked them to be a liaison, sort of an official liaison?
There's a lot of ideas to talk about, and I don't know if it deserves an agenda item to keep us on track, because I think there's some really great things we can do. And I actually think it's going to be pretty easy once we, I think that there will be a receptive liaison in most neighborhoods, and we can work to, yeah.
I was impressed by the way that task force operated when they asked for public input, established, and then responded to what the public said, rather than the usual, let's cut it in stone and then respond to it.
Paul, can you make sure your mic's on?
Yeah, I think
Okay.
it is. I'm just not talking about it.
Okay.
I think this sounds great, and it does sound like we probably want to actually put it on an agenda
Oh,
so we
that'll
can
help.
hear your ideas and think through them, and maybe approve a plan. I know one of the things that we've heard from staff is that the outreach piece is something that is really important for us to be individually involved with and collectively. So
Great.
it sounds great.
Just one minor correction, although probably important. The timeline, as Paul said, is the plan needs to be adopted by February 2024. Backing up, that means ideally council's not trying to decide whether to adopt it while they're finalizing the budget. So we would like for them to be taking their action at the beginning of December, not in February.
December 2023 is really
Correct,
the.
which backs it up to basically you would be having a complete plan for public hearing by August of 23. So you're really at 1 year for this plan.
Yeah.
Just to be clear on that.
Okay, yeah, that was their first question.
Yep.
That they want to ask us tomorrow. The rest of the questions, we can share with you, but I don't think they're questions that either Monica or I are prepared to respond to, other than
Well,
to say, you know, come-
Fantastic that you're out there and listening to folks. So,
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, and then my other announcement is that I guess I don't know what the outcome will be yet. I believe it's the city council meeting on the 1st where they will make a decision. But I know that in the last city council meeting, city councilors were asked whether expanding the membership on planning commission, DRB, and I don't know, maybe city council, if that's a priority for the city council. And I think there was support for it, but we'll know on the August 1st meeting if in fact they're going to say, yes, that's a priority for us, and then put an action plan in place. It would take voter approval to change the numbers of the members on anything. But personally, I thought that was a good thing. And so I'm just watching for that.
And then has to go to the legislature, I think, right? Charter change.
I don't know. I don't know what the full
most
process is.
likely, yes. There's sort of an odd piece of legislation that passed this year that sort of authorizes certain things to be just voter approval, but it doesn't contemplate that a city's charter would have a specific number. So we're going to have to do a legal analysis on that, but possibly yes. And certainly for the council arrangement, and Paul's on the charter committee, that's been something that's been given to the charter committee to think about a structure of governance more broadly. It's at the council level.
Right, I assume we do all of that under the changes in the composition of the council also.
And if we did have more members here, that would be that many fewer neighborhoods we'd each have to be assigned to. Anyway.
Any other announcements? Paul?
Just a quick one to say that the Climate Action Plan Task Force is going to be on Thursday, seeing the first draft of the plan itself. It is posted to our website. They're also signing up for themselves and also Energy Committee members to some attending the Sobu Night Out and certain other events. And that's being helped by a couple of folks from the Energy Committee who are spearheading the sort of organization of that. And they asked me to ask you all, in the event that there are some nights when they have fewer than the ideal number of folks, would commissioners be interested and willing to serve a little bit of time and maybe answer some questions and things like that, or at least hear feedback? So no need to answer, but I'm going to send you a note via email this week to share that opportunity for you. And it'll be also a nice opportunity if you choose to start to engage with folks in the comprehensive plan in sort of a one-on-one basis.
Yep, I go occasionally. Haven't been this year yet, but
We've only
it's
missed
a
one,
good,
Michael. It's
it's
okay.
a good, but in prior years, it's a very good place to talk to people, exchange ideas, tell them what we're doing.
Great.
I was there on Thursday and it was packed.
It's a beautiful night.
It was a
right?
beautiful night, but it was, I mean, there were a lot of people there, which was great to see, but it was very well attended.
Neat.
Yeah, a lot
Oh,
of
would
people
that be
say
like
it's the best
table?
one of
It's gonna
all
be a
the
table
family
tent.
things
We're gonna,
around.
at least for the first one, we're gonna use the Energy Committee's banner because they happen to have a banner, and it's, broadly speaking, it's the same subject, but we will hope to have one that speaks climate action also. So, yeah. That's what I got.
Okay, so we can get started.
Okay, so I'm running the next item here, which is the election of the officers. At least I'll do the chair part. And then depending on what happens from there, then we would go on. So as I said in the staff notes, I'll accept a nomination or nominations for chair. Ted.
I'd like to place a nomination, Jessica Luiso, with whom I've served, gosh, I don't even know how many years it's been, but many years it seems. And one of the things that really stands out is she's incredibly fair. She doesn't use the position to pontificate or control the discussion. She gives everyone a fair chance. So that's my nomination.
Are there any other nominations for chair? Going once, going twice.
You're welcome to do it.
I don't hear any other nominations for chair. Jessica, if elected, would you serve another year as chair?
I would.
I do.
Great.
I do.
So then I'm going to call a vote on it. If there are no other nominations, all those in favor of Jessica serving as chair, please say aye or raise your hand.
Aye.
That is 6-0 with one presumed abstention.
I abstained. Yeah.
So it is back to you.
Okay, well,
Oh, Sarah. You're muted, but I either see that you're in support or you're
Yes,
in
I
support
am
of
in
peace.
support. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks, Sarah.
thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Ted. That was very, very nice of you. I will strive to continue to live up to that. Okay, so so then I will run the nomination for vice chair. Are there any nominations for someone to serve vice chair?
I would nominate Paul Engels.
Okay. Paul, if elected, would you serve?
I would, with the stipulation that I'd like to be involved in setting the agenda.
Any other nominations? Ted?
I'd like to nominate Duncan McDonald.
Okay, Duncan, if elected, would you serve?
I would.
Okay. Any discussion? Do we have discussion on the motion?
I guess you should ask if there's any other nominations.
Are there any other nominations? Yes, yes. Okay, seeing none. Okay, so all in favor, we'll go in chronological order here. So all in favor of having Paul Engels serve as vice chair? Looks like 2. All in favor of Duncan? 4. And 1 abstention,
Yeah.
maybe?
You can vote for yourself.
Okay.
You can vote a couple times.
For yourself? Yes, very good. So Duncan will serve as vice chair for the year. And thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you, Paul, for your willingness to serve as well. So we also have a clerk position. Are there any nominations for clerk?
I would nominate Monica Ospey for
Okay,
the clerk position.
Monica, would you be willing to serve as clerk for another session if elected?
Yes, I would.
Okay, any other nominations for clerk? Okay, all in favor of Monica serving as clerk, say aye. Aye. Okay, that was unanimous. Very good.
Thank you.
We also need to affirm our regular meeting dates and times. So right now they are the 2nd and 4th Tuesdays at 7 p.m. in the City Hall, except as modified for breaks and holidays. We've taken a special, we've been trying quite hard to shift our meeting days when it falls on a holiday or an election day in many cases. So
You need a motion.
we do need a motion.
So moved.
Okay,
2nd and 4th Tuesdays at 7 p.m. City Hall, except as modified for breaks and holidays.
Oh, second.
Monica seconded. Okay, any discussion on meeting? Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
Right.
Aye.
Okay, unanimous. Great. So moving on, review and possible request city committees to consider items raised during the public feedback on the 2021-2022 LDR amendments. So there's a small description here in our agenda about this. These were a few items that were flagged during the public comment period that we felt like could use some additional attention, possibly by a few of the different committees. And as staff has in the notes here, that some of them may be a little more technical and may be better served to kind of be directed towards public works or maybe staff level, or some may be best served to go to a committee. But tonight is for discussion of kind of if we want these to go to a committee, and if so, kind of to provide a charge. Do you have a question, Michael? Michael and then
Yes, I
Monica?
do have, there were a lot of comments from the public about a large number of issues, some of which became parts. The public had difficulty with some of the things which we in fact enacted. And I thought that was what we should go back to, because I think that needs some review. We're talking about responding to the public input back then. So there may be items that we unanimously approved to get the LDRs done, but that maybe should be revisited. And I would have to look at the whole list of, or we could look at that list and see which are the ones that came up many times by many members of the public. Maybe pick out those few.
Okay, and that's, I think we're not saying we're not doing that, but these specific ones on the screen were
Yep.
specifically called out as potentially committee items at the time and kind of specifically put as a separate work item
Yes,
on our work
and
plan.
the
just
tree
to-
ordinance was a hot one for me.
Yeah,
And I'm very keen.
so I think this agenda item, what we're doing tonight is
Yep.
kind of specific to the
fine.
committee related items. Monica?
So I had trouble getting onto the city's site to find our old meeting minutes, but I know numerous times, and I tried to find my notes too. I know numerous times there were 4 things that we all actually agreed in motions to ask committees to do. And one of them was relating to the Bike and Ped Committee, was asking them specifically to look at bike and ped safety in the transit overlay district. Given that we're looking at putting more housing in there, we had specific conversations about looking at overall, and we had, discussed, is it Kennedy Drive? Is it what? And we decided it is the transit overlay district, period. So I hope that that can be included there. We talked about things, which is, like the fact that we can today enact a 25-mile-per-hour speed limit outside of all of our schools, and none of South Burlington has those. So I think we definitely talked about it. We definitely had a motion and supported that. The other one that we had on the list at the time, and I think things have changed, but it was along with this, was sending to the Affordable Housing Committee the question about owning versus rent. Now, I know that there's a bigger level conversation happening, but I just wanted to state that we did also have the motion. I believe there was a motion, and we agreed to pass that at the appropriate time to the Affordable Housing Committee for their opinion. So maybe just at least discussing, is that still what we want them to do? Or has there been a bigger level conversation about it that would have us go back on that? So those are my 2.
I thought that we felt that the commission getting involved in trying to regulate what's rental and what's homeowner was legally quite complex and difficult.
Well, back when we were doing the IZ stuff, which is what this pertains to, those were the 4 things that so I don't know what the status is. I don't know if we should therefore not be asking the Affordable Housing Committee to, but we did have it on our to-do list specifically to ask them for their thoughts, so.
Yeah, and I think, didn't we say we did want a legal idea as to how, if that was,
Yes, but I
avail-
don't know that wound up getting a majority of the commission. I'm gonna have to go back to the minutes and
Okay.
see on a vote to
Yeah.
have us do that exploration.
um,
These 2 were specific things that I believe you had collected, Jessica, from the October feedback on the LDRs, and that you had all decided that collectively these 2 should be sent to a committee. So that's why we picked out these 2. At that time, they were specific sort of things that you all agreed were worthy of follow-up, but were not able to do at the time of that round of LDR amendments.
yeah, okay, so here's my notes. November 2nd, I wrote down items to committee D11 bike ped street type, bike ped / street type. And I wrote yes behind it, and then NRC exempt restoration, tree ordinance, soil restoration. Commit to adjustments in the next year. What I wrote, we agreed to, and then land use regulation, that was a different thing. Okay, so that's what we wrote down from that meeting specifically. So Monica, I think you're right. Like those items are things we talked about. But they're maybe not in this agenda item.
Well, if we're going to go to the Bike and Ped Committee, it seems appropriate to at least review that one question. And I'm sorry that I was going to try to search the minutes, but I'm not able to get on the city site from my house for whatever reason. So
Well, my suggestion would be, this is a fairly technical ask of them. And what you're bringing up is a good idea, Monica, but it's a much broader question of sort of policy of, are we prioritizing safety and connectivity in those areas? And I think if you loop them together, you may find that it'll be a long time before you get an answer to either of them. This is a fairly technical ask that you could have a response back in the not too distant future. I might suggest that on both of the other two, that those be questions that you ask of those two committees to consider as they're weighing in on the comprehensive plan, because it's really those are big picture questions that aren't about an individual problem. It's about an overall, what's the focus of effort in the city. So that would
it's
be,
fine. I mean, there
we
are
also-
also,
We also talked about street safety when we were looking at the ARPA funds. And I think that was one of the 3 buckets that we picked on that needs funding.
yeah, so, and there are, like I said, there has been low hanging fruit that's been identified. So, and we are talking about sending more housing to the transit overlay district. So I think if we can maybe go back and look at the minutes and see what our motion was. And if it's appropriate to talk about at least letting them know that we are interested and concerned in bike and ped safety in the urban overlay district. And we're going to want to make sure. I mean, I actually took a picture of the corner of Swift and Shelburne Road. And I don't know how anyone survives that corner right there. It's very dangerous. And we're talking about building up. So I think it's a priority and we did talk about it. So
Okay.
I'm just sorry I couldn't
Yeah,
find
no,
them.
and that's fine, Monica. I think, like I said, this agenda item was very specifically following up on that November 2nd, thing. So we can talk about that also.
We just add, and safety, in other words, after street type standards and safety. Those 2 words. And
If they have some ideas.
I think Paul has a valid point. They would need traffic management expertise. Not that they couldn't do it if they have that expertise available to them. Then I'd be happy to add safety. But the bike and ped committee on their own, I think are going to need some expert advice.
as a little bit of additional context to this, the city council is, as you know, going through their policy priority discussion. And one of the recommendations that's come through the leadership team, including Public Works, is that the city this year develop a stronger, more clear filter for how to prioritize capital projects, whether it's a request for from a neighborhood for a stop sign analysis, or it's prioritizing which of these 6 bike ped capital projects to study and then do. And I think that this aligns really nicely with that part of it, because as a dispersed growing city, we have more needs than we have year over year capacity to do. And so I think a big question, and our new public works director is a big advocate, and we just, as of last week, I should have put this in an announcement, have a capital projects director for the city. It's a new position to help organize all this kind of thing. So I would suggest that this sort of is already starting to happen. And I would certainly welcome the bike ped committee weighing in on it. I just think it's a different ask than a review of street type standards, because Donna's comments were really about curbs and widths of bike lanes to make sure that they're always at least 5 feet. It was very sort of specific things and not a broad policy question.
So that's what I was going to ask Paul or Jessica. Can you just spend maybe 30 seconds? What's the thrust and nature of the comments? Because
Sure. So
so we
on
can
the
actually
bike
get to
ped
the item.
ones, Donna had provided, so the city now has a singular set of model street types for new development and redevelopment. We used to have 3 different sets of standards. We now have 1 in there. And with each of these models, they say things like there should be 10 to 11 foot drive lanes, and there should be a green belt that's X and a sidewalk that's Y, and depending on which one, it has a different kind of bike facility. Donna had some specific comments about adjusting those a little bit, of saying here, you're saying that it only needs to be a 4-foot bike lane, best practice is a 5-foot bike lane. There are certain circumstances where instead of having a vertical curb, that having a 45-degree angle curb makes it safer, that if a bike ever had to sort of jump out of the way, that they can do that kind of feedback. So that was and I'm sure there's more, but it was that kind of input. And then the natural resources was sort of a mix, but I think you can see it in there, the possibility of an exemption from certain standards for projects that are specifically about restoring natural resources, and then recommendations around best practices for when construction is taking place.
So on the bike ped stuff, would we be asking that committee to go and like flesh out her comments because they're not granular enough for us to consider them now? Is that the point?
Well, and they were her individual comments,
Okay.
not as
As a committee?
not as a committee.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I think the question would be, you're on a committee, we think there's merit to this, but you guys are the ones who spend your time thinking about bike ped policy.
And then we would expect them to come with recommendations.
Yes, and I think too, we'd also want to have Public Works weigh in on them as well, because they're their facilities to maintain, so.
So the idea would be to consider the comments,
And provide recommendations to the commission.
provide recs. And then after we have the recommendations, would we run them by the Public Works Committee to see?
Well, we don't,
Or you
you mean
would do
Public
that-
Works
Yeah,
Department.
department.
I'd probably send it to both at the same time and just say the commission is asking for feedback on these, and they can coordinate.
Okay. And then I think the recommendation was to have some kind of timeline of some kind on this. So it's not just an open-ended ask. But I think they only meet monthly, so they'd probably need a few meetings to get through it and consider and maybe do some research. Do they meet over the summer? Definitely.
They were not meeting this month, at least. I'm not sure about next month because they don't have a staff person at the moment.
Okay,
So I would suggest that, that the comments were from October. I would give them some time and ask them for beginning of December. Maybe it's a timeline. It's really just to make sure that it's not a forever timeline. And if they turn it around faster in their schedule, then that's great.
okay. Seems reasonable. Because then they'll have multiple meetings to mull it over and maybe have people research and come back. Okay, do we need, what's the best way to, should we just give you the general direction and then? Or do we
I
need
think it
to
would be
make
good to
a-
get to have a motion of making the request. That way it's in the minutes officially.
Okay,
So the motion, just to clarify, the motion would be to ask the Bike and Ped Committee to study Donna's comments and do a general review of street type standards and then report their recommendations back to the city, to the planning commission.
Yes.
By early December.
Beg your pardon?
By early December. Isn't that what we're
Yeah.
gonna- Yeah.
And within that motion, where are the specific comments? Can we put in the motion? Or, I mean, we will be providing them very specifically to the committee, right? We're not just going to say, go find Donna's comments.
I can provide them to the committee. Yes.
Yep.
So do you need me to repeat that or is?
Well, I would just amend the motion that we
I
would
don't think
be
that that needs to be in a
providing.
minute, that
Okay.
I'm going to provide the information that they
Okay.
need. I think that's just an administrative function.
Okay.
I would say, second.
Okay, any discussion? So all in favor?
Aye.
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 Um,
And then on the other piece, we're leaving that to a general discussion pertaining to the comp plan, the overall safety.
I think so. I mean, does
Not
it,
adding
does
safety
it
to this,
seem,
right?
is that close enough to this agenda item that we could make a second motion on a longer time frame to ask them about bike safety recommendations? Or do we
I
need to
guess my
kind of
question for
frame
you
it?
is, I would suggest that you might want to frame it, because if that's the only question, is that the only question that you're asking of them in the comp plan? Because if you give them that one question, then you're not really asking them other
Yeah.
questions.
So maybe we
um,
need to talk a little bit more about like what other things we might want them to weigh in on in the context of like of the comp plan. Just that-
I'm assuming that at some point we will have an item agenda that will involve us. What are we gonna task to different committees for the comp plan?
Yes.
Okay, so it
Yep.
seems like that,
This
this
is-
conversation would
this
fall
is
under
a
that.
little
purview.
different.
Yeah,
Yeah,
okay,
this is a consequence of
Yeah.
input that we got last
okay.
October.
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up on Monica's idea to make sure we had a plan for when we were gonna get back to that. Okay, the next item then is the Natural Resource Committee. So there were a few items listed here. I think a few of these actually came specifically from the comments from this committee, but not all of them. Or individual members of the committee, because I think maybe they hadn't all voted on all of them. So they're listed out on the screen there. You know, and each of them at this point is kind of like a general concept. So it seems like, to me, we might want a little more information about what the real ask is for each of these, because, you know, maybe like the definition of a natural resource project or.
Right. I think the largest of the three is the middle one there, the tree ordinance, large tree considerations, because I think that would need to be something that is pretty fleshed out as to what is meant by that. The restoration projects, you're going to be talking about that a little later on in your agenda already. And the soil restoration, I guess that's also a sort of a broad question about what the intent of that is.
I just wanted to remind that we did really, in relation to that, we did specifically talk about, I found my paper from November. We specifically talked about policies to protect and relocate topsoil. Remember, when we shared some information about what they're doing in the UK, and I think Donna's the one that brought this up in comments, but then we furthered the conversation by talking specifically about not just the soil restoration that we already have in our plan, but to specifically talk about protecting and relocating topsoil. So very specific to topsoil. I have Donna, I
No,
don't know.
I think it was Donna.
Well, is this like about reconstructing wetlands and stormwater basins? And is that like, what's the nature of the
I think
projects?
it's more along the lines of, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's what happens to the soil around a greenfield development. How is it treated?
This whole item is about?
No,
that?
no, no,
It's that
just,
last
Oh,
one.
no, I'm sorry. My question was more general about the item. Like, what are the restoration projects that
Oh,
we're talking about?
so restoration projects often are things like either a stormwater enhancement project or a erosion control in some way. There's, I think Dave Wheeler had come to one of our meetings and shown how there's, lots of examples of where a small culvert in the past has sort of ripped open the land below it. And there are various projects that are taken, that have
And the
taken place
concern now
inside
is that
us
if
or
you
others.
can't, build within the buffer, you can't do those projects that may be beneficial.
yeah, well, so
Right.
like I work on a lot of these in some towns, so I do maybe like a dam removal, and the dam is being removed to provide fish passage, and then you're restoring the stream. And some towns have like exemptions where you don't have to go through site plan, or you might not have to do certain things.
That makes sense. But does the Natural Resource Committee have the expertise? I mean, that sounds like very civil engineering type.
Stormwater type.
I
Like,
Yeah, I guess I feel like the committee might be able to at least give some recommendations. Like they might not know a dam removal shouldn't have to go through site plan, but they might have maybe a list of types of restoration projects they feel like are important or
And maybe a lay person's description of what those are.
yeah.
It sounds really important, but it almost sounds like something that a consultant would, I don't know, to me, as a layperson,
Yeah, I
it might
mean,
be like,
Two
something-
of those are really policy oriented. Well, are broad policy. The third one is sort of specific. This restoration one is really more of a, it's, do you want to make it easier to do the projects or not, sort of question. So
but do we need to go back to the Natural Resource Committee to answer that question?
maybe you don't. So that's why these are on your agenda to
Right.
talk about.
But wait, but that's
well,
where-
Duncan
sorry.
had his hand up.
No, I was gonna, when Dave, was it
Wheeler, yeah.
he came in front of us and talked about a project that I know because it was the bottom of my neighborhood. And I can't remember, was the exemption for the stormwater pond?
That one was
that was where-
specifically about allowing stormwater restoration projects where there's a habitat block, I think
Mhm.
was his question. But there might have been, or maybe it was exempting it from going to the DRB. That was another question of like, can this be done administratively to
Mhm.
save 2 months of process if it's essentially a city-sponsored project to improve water
Which
quality?
I guess that's a great example, Andrew, what we're trying to do.
You know,
Yeah.
I hear that. It
I-
seems to
Heather.
me that if there's gonna be a project like that, there should be some exemption process that's
I mean,
streamlined.
you can just give us the direction now to say you'd like for us to look into this and come back to you with recommendations. You don't have to
That would
send
be
it to
my
the committee.
perspective.
That's,
Actually, now that Andrew brought it up, we've gotten a lot of great help from the Regional Planning Commission too. Monica, I'm
So
sorry, I
just to
missed
be
you.
clear, though, the comment that came in November that we talked about that relates to this is not just in green areas, it is in building areas. So that when there's land when there's land previously not built on that's being disrupted, to specifically have policy in place to protect and relocate and reuse the topsoil.
right, but that's the top. I think Andrew's talking specifically about the first of the three things.
No, I know, but I'm just saying separately, this one is not on there and it does not relate to the green area. So I just want to point out, we did talk about topsoil relocation and protection. That's not on. We have soil restoration.
What other words would you want to add to that in an ask?
Well, when we were just talking about soil restoration, Paul's comment was in green fields. And so what I'm trying to say is we discussed it as being broader than just in green fields. We discussed it as being when untouched land is going to be touched and buildings are going to be built, that the topsoil there is extremely valued, not
I
just
think we're saying
financially
the same
valuable.
thing. That's what I mean when I say greenfield development.
But is
So
that what you mean?
Monica
is
Is
just
that
one-
what soil restoration means? Because in my mind, it means something different, I guess. I know there's a
Amendment.
lot of efforts around the country to make topsoils, more, improve the carbon sequestration, to rejuvenate topsoils and
Soil
in and apart from development, right?
Right, so
it-
we have something in place, and then there was something about what Donna was bringing up that we did talk about that was different than what we're doing now. And it was a little bit more strict, and there was concern about, yes, but what would this do to the development process? And I think that's why we wanted to get a committee involved in understanding how is this different than what we require now? And how much more are we asking of developers by adding this topsoil specific relocation? There's something that we're not doing now that came out in that conversation, and I don't remember what it was.
I
And
think-
it was, how much of a burden is this to getting buildings built if we were to add it? So
Well, and I guess I'd say the third question for that one specifically to me would be, and what expectation of enforcement would come out of that? Because we're not on site visiting projects as they're built today. So that's,
Which
Yeah,
I
I think
think,
Donna-
is-
Andrew's well aware on other subjects.
yeah,
Michael and I both.
yeah, okay.
Donna was really concerned about the disruption and destruction of topsoil that happens in a construction project. And what happens afterwards, is there any restoration? Is there any, that was more my sense of what she was concerned about. I have similar concerns, but even much deeper. I have concerns about the destruction of the underlying geology of where we live because of all the blasting that goes on here. I mean, it's not something that we can attack here, but something that you should all think about. I don't think we should disrupt the natural geology of where we live. You know, ledge is there for a reason.
Well,
It's millions of years of sediment and it serves a purpose.
okay, so.
Just one last, on the tree ordinance, large tree considerations, is that yet a separate item?
Yeah.
And just so maybe, what's that one about?
I believe that one, so we currently have a tree ordinance in the city, but it only applies to trees in the city rights of way. So it's city-owned trees. I believe that the idea that had
15A,
been,
12.
the comment that had been provided was about should individual or clusters of large trees on private land be a consideration in land development. And there is some of it in our updated regulations, but the commission didn't feel at the last October that you had the time to sort of dive into that question as to what extent the concern is being addressed or not.
So,
So
I'm
that-
So
sorry,
I
Paul,
have
can
a
you help me? I
note from
thought they were-
that. I have a note from that. It was again from November, pertains to 15A12, and it was establish a ban on large heritage landmarks, significant canopy tree removal without a permit or stipulation. So basically on individual properties, having some kind of ban or need to seek approval to remove heritage landmarks, significant canopy trees.
And we've had a case in point, which was that as a consequence of the jam litigation, the judge specified what the developer can and cannot do. The developer submitted a plan of the trees that they would remove and how they would replace them. And they didn't comply. So they were actually fined a few pennies by us, by the city. So, you know, enforcement is just not, doesn't make any sense because the fine was too little. It was like $600 because they cut down some really big trees that they shouldn't have. It's up on the copse west of Golf Course Road, that new development there. So I think the tree ordinance needs reinforcement. I don't know. I haven't read the city's current tree ordinance, but
Well, again, the current tree ordinance only applies
Yes,
to
I
trees
got
in
it.
the city right of way. So it's really not, it's about sort of how we plan to maintain our own trees and how other people can't cut down our trees.
It would be great to do a survey of best practices around the country. I mean, I'm personally familiar with tree ordinances that I think are more impactful than the one we have, and be useful to see what, you know, a survey of those and consider some stronger protection.
Yeah, so I think we can add that what you said into this instead of just saying the words tree ordinance / large tree considerations. Like we can beef that up with what Monica and Andrew just said.
I found this document that we had shared. I mean, I found it and I forwarded it to you guys, so it's not coming from the public, but this is a construction code of practice for the sustainable use of soils on construction sites. And we just specifically talked about that and said, gee, what would the impact be on, what would this do to a development project? So I will reshare this. And it seems like if we're going back to them and we wanted their opinion on that, this would be a good thing to include.
So I guess what I'm hearing so far is that the first one, we might want to just tackle that ourselves, maybe with help from the RPC or something and staff.
Mhm.
Because we already like the idea of exempting the natural resource projects from certain standards, and it might be better for somebody who's more familiar with the process to help figure out that streamlining.
Yeah, what kind of exemptions are we thinking of?
Well, Paul gave a few ideas of ways to streamline the process.
So we'll talk about one of them in the next item, but for example, right now there are no exceptions to doing work in steep slope areas, so 25% slope areas. So if somebody wanted to be doing a project to restore a stream bank that was steep, they can put it back exactly the way it was. They can't improve it. There is no provision that allows for it. So that would be an exemption to say, if what you're doing is about improving the stream health and you've got an engineer doing it,
So it's a positive exemption rather than.
correct. These are exemptions to do positive things. Or it might be a review process exemption to make it faster and easier to do these projects so that they get done more quickly. I know that was one of the things that our stormwater division advocated for, and we did do some of it in the last round, but given the scale of the number of projects that they are trying to deliver for the community, if it can speed up by 3 months in process, then they can get more done in a year.
Okay, and so that was the first one. Do we want to just make a decision on that one? Maybe talk about the three of these separately?
It seems to me like everyone here would be, I mean, I know we're going to talk about the next item, but I think that we could probably move that on our own, give Paul some direction on that and come back with some feedback.
Would it be helpful for us to give you more specific feedback now, or just that
I think
general?
that's general. That's good for right now. We'll talk about a couple of examples in a few minutes, and then I can take that as broad guidance for work that we're going to do.
Okay, and then the next one, because I know we talked about these little disjointedly, would still be for the Natural Resource Committee to talk about the tree ordinance and large tree considerations. And then I also wrote down to specifically consider expanding the tree ordinance with more protections for trees and a ban on removal of heritage large canopy trees. Possibly more enforcement.
Mhm.
On private property.
Yeah, I think,
That's
yeah,
the
expansion.
intention, yeah.
Or to expand from just the right of way to the rest of the city, right? Just, and then Sarah, did you have something? You want to go ahead?
Very quickly, I remember when I spoke about this at one point, it was along the lines of having some kind of a permit process for private landowners, that there would be a definition of what trees were important size-wise or otherwise in the ordinance. And then there'd be a process whereby a landowner would have to obtain permission to remove a tree. And, it might be for safety reasons because it was failing in health and threatening a building or something like that, or it might just be for looks, and that wouldn't be a good reason to remove a tree, an otherwise healthy tree. So some kind of permit process is what I had in mind.
And I don't know if I would specifically say in the direction large heritage trees, because I can imagine the best practice might be to focus on maybe even some smaller diameter trees. I think in the community I came from, you needed a permit for anything over 6 inches in diameter. So, I mean, it'd just be good to see what's out there and best practice before giving specific direction,
Invasives exempted.
for sure. But I guess just it'd be good to see like what's out there,
Yeah.
best practice.
Okay.
And broadly speaking, properties that are other than single and two family homes are captured under what Andrew discussed, because they're subject to site plans, and site plans have to be reviewed for those. So, that narrows the subject a little bit. I would encourage that if you do ask the committee to explore it, that, looking at some best practices of how is that administered in other places, because
Mhm.
we do have 5,000 or 6,000 properties.
Yeah.
And so thinking about how does one do that in a way that is manageable too. if they
This
want to
might be
explore
a
it.
great feedback item for neighborhoods. I'm guessing we might get some feedback that wasn't, what we want to hear, but maybe we need to hear.
Well, and that's where I wonder if there isn't, and this might be a comp plan conversation, and maybe the Natural Resource Committee can help, but maybe there's, if we can't make it a policy because we can't enforce it, are there educational things we can do? I mean, who has the, raise the blade, who's doing that? And are there things that we can do outside of policy, or ask committees to consider finding ways outside of policy that support a general, what is our purview And how can we?
So
do
your
something like
ask
that?
could be a little bit broader than if you wanted, Monica. It doesn't have to be about regulations. It could be to explore these subject areas a little bit more thoroughly and come back with some recommendations.
Yeah, they need to consult. I mean, the Raise the Blade campaign came from the Aiken Center down on Spear Street, as well as another project of theirs, which was permeable parking lots and driveways. So the UVM has a lot of expertise probably. I would suggest that the Natural Resource Committee consult with other organizations like the Aiken Center. And then, as Andrew says, look around. There must be tons and tons of
There
tree
are.
ordinances in other towns and cities that we could look at and pick the best of.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm also not sure it's fatal that it can't be completely enforced. Having something on the books alone sometimes incents behavior, and I think other towns do it that way. And if some people want
Yes,
to
the
sneak and do
challenge
things,
becomes when a neighbor is not happy with something, and then we have to do selective enforcement.
uh,
That's really messy because we don't really like doing enforcement by complaint.
right?
That's not but I
Yeah.
hear your point.
Yeah. And, I do agree with Monica's idea, of just maybe looking more broadly, because maybe there's like pieces that can be educational or, encouraging. Okay. Do we need Paul, sorry.
Are there communities that prohibit the removal of topsoil?
I mean, in the UK, I sent this link again to everyone, but there are. Or if
I
you
don't know.
remove it, that you do something specific with it, it's contained, and because that actual topsoil is what cannot be replicated, so.
Is
you're
that what we're
saving it.
talking about? Restoration?
I think what Monica is saying is if they remove the topsoil, they have to restore it.
They have to use it
If
either elsewhere or there, but it can't just be dumped and
Yeah.
pushed into a stream and, or
Well,
buried.
it's-
Well, sold
It's never
elsewhere.
pushed into a stream, just to be clear. We have very strict erosion control measures, just to be like, this is recorded and it's public. I just want to be clear, that's not happening, at least not in our boundaries.
Well, when you buy a piece of
Wow.
property,
Unless it's on ag land, then it happens sometimes.
Paul, go ahead.
buy a piece of property, you usually think you're buying topsoil. I mean, that's what, the value of land has always been in the past, So,
Oh, I think there's different things. So, the state stormwater operational permit does have some basic guidelines on this topic where, like, if you disturb your site and then it's a planted area or like lawn, you need to have like a certain number of inches of topsoil put back on. It can't be compacted. They have a way of testing it where you take a shovel, like a person takes a shovel, like a spade, and just with the weight of their person without jumping on it, needs to be able to like have the shovel go in a certain number of inches. And you have to like walk around your site and every certain number of feet do the shovel test. So I mean, it's like part of that permit, but not all projects going through our city are getting that permit. And we might want to do something else. Like maybe there's other things, or maybe we could even have, maybe the committee will come back and say, that's a good testing requirement, but we want to have them also do it in these other circumstances, or, so, I mean, I think people are starting to recognize that it's important that you don't just wind up with rock.
Rock garden.
I think the Climate Action Task Force will also have some recommendations related to trees and their maintenance.
Did you have anything else, Paul?
No,
Did you?
thanks.
Okay, I don't know that we narrowed down our ask really well. We did a couple different ideas.
My suggestion would be maybe to give it as a fairly broad ask for them to explore this subject a little bit further and maybe provide a report or a presentation or a memo to you all about what they're thinking on the subject. I think both of these are pretty substantial things that aren't going to be they're not like the bike ped one where it's a technical fix. They're pretty big. And of course, the committee is going to have to weave this in with whatever the council assigns as big picture policy. So I would suggest that maybe it be a broad ask for them to explore these subjects a little further and come back with best practices and some recommendations to you.
I would just add that they do both, maybe the regulatory and the education front.
Okay.
I did find the one other very specific thing that we had talked about, which is not on this list. And that was, I know that we have since added private or semi-private outdoor space in the generic PUD. But there was a question for, there was a statement that we should ask the Affordable Housing Committee to discuss the impact on developers if we require private outdoor space per unit. That was something we had discussed tasking to the Affordable Housing Committee, and that was
Do
on
you-
either on 2/11 or on January 25th.
I believe in that case, you went ahead and did it. So
No, I
all-
never did, because I didn't know what the specific,
No, like you, the commission. So the new regulations require of all new housing and all new commercial that there be outdoor space associated, site amenity associated with it.
right, but we did not discuss specifically whether it should be private versus semi-private.
Ah,
Yeah,
okay.
and so you guys wanted to know with the development, what's the impact to developers and builders if that is required per unit. And I never asked the Affordable Housing Committee to do that. There was never an official, that was let's have this on the list to ask them, and we have not done so. So I just wanted to, it was in my notes from this time, and I wanted to restate that we had discussed asking that question, whether you still want to, but we
Okay.
did discuss doing that.
Could we group that with the request that Chris had? I mean, would that be, we were, because we were going to put that on an agenda.
Yeah, I mean, I guess my suggestion to this one is you did just put in the standards to have the site amenity. And I mean, certainly if you want to explore this question further, go for it. I think my sense is maybe let's see what happens with this new standard that's come in and what kinds of site amenities you're getting for a couple of years and then see. But if you feel strongly that you want to explore the private versus semi-private, then go for it.
I think we wanted to know how much of an impact it would really be on developers when they're building something from scratch, if it really is a cost or a prohibited issue to them. So I think that's still a question that's fair for us to get an answer to.
Just for clarification, you're talking about indoor space?
No, the
Yeah.
private outdoor space, be it
Like a
a
balcony.
Juliet
Oh, okay,
balcony
all right, all
or
right,
whatever it
all right,
is.
right.
Yeah. Yeah, we specifically said, let's not make it per unit. Let's get the Affordable Housing Committees to discuss their thoughts on that, and specifically reaching out to builders to see how much of a burden it would be for them to do that. So, and then later came the other work. So, I mean, I don't know what the harm is in asking them to consider that unless it's taking them off a path that's.
Well, I guess we don't have any asks for the Affordable Housing Committee in this agenda item. So with the other one you brought up.
Well,
we
but we're
s-
not I'm sorry, we're not frequently discussing technical items and what was the language?
To ask.
So maybe,
committees.
yeah, I mean, these are, what did you call it? These are consider LDR amendments. So I guess maybe it's not relating to a specific amendment, but we're not frequently. This is the first time we're discussing making requests to the city committees in a long time, and these were on our list. And I guess that's how I see it fitting into item 5.
Oh, okay, I see. I see.
Yeah. I mean, it doesn't seem to me to be a very large ask, because talking to a few, it's just I think we were hoping to understand, is it a burden or is it not a burden? When you're starting from scratch, is it or is it not a burden to have to include private per unit?
Right, I mean,
You
we
know.
can ask, I suppose.
What we do with it, we don't have a plan yet, but
Do you think that we can finish the ask for the Natural Resource Committee? And then if you want, and then you could make a motion about that if you want to.
Sure.
Okay, so just to make sure we're finished with the Natural Resource Committee one. So we had made a motion for the bike ped one. I think we probably should do the same here for the Natural Resource Committee. Does someone want to try to
We're
summarize?
going to deal with the restoration projects outside of that.
Yes.
So we're talking about tree ordinance, large tree conservation, soil restoration, construction conservation. Those second.
Yeah.
third items.
I move to ask the Natural Resource Committee to make recommendations, both regulatory and non-regulatory, in terms of best practices around tree ordinances and soil restoration in the city.
That sounds wonderful. Do we want to put some kind of timeline, maybe like a year or something like that, or 6 months? Or do we want to give
Within
them
6 months.
something?
Within 6 months.
Was that,
I'll second that.
Okay. I think Michael seconded that. Okay, any discussion on the motion?
as long as the soil restoration can clearly be differentiated from what's up above, and that it's topsoil protection. So,
Great. All in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Okay, unanimous. Okay, before we move on, it sounded like Monica, you wanted to,
I'll make a
mention one
motion
other.
that we ask the Affordable Housing Committee to give opinion on and discuss the impact on builders of requiring private outdoor space per unit within the next 6 months.
So just to be clear on that, so that they understand, would it be in addition to the existing requirements, or as a way of accomplishing the existing requirements? Because I think to a builder, that's two very different
Yeah.
questions. If you're saying I can do the balconies instead of having to do anything on the ground versus in addition to,
I think
Or
it
is the
was
question-
I think it was really a technical question for builders when they're putting a building together, forgetting about what regulations are. Is it cost prohibitive to have a outdoor space per unit? I think that's what we were discussing, that we don't know. So if
Private.
is that private outdoor space per unit? So
think-
if that can be, if that,
This
does
is
that
not covered in our general PUD, site amenities,
it's private or semi.
private or semi.
so, but I think Paul has a good point. Is this in addition to what they're already providing? So that is a big question.
or is the
because that's-
question just,
yeah.
what's the cost of doing it, period?
What's the cost of doing it? Is the cost, is there an impact on cost to do this at all? So that
And-
regardless of regulation, because if it is prohibitively expensive, that would, maybe we don't change what we're doing and discuss regulation. If it's not, if they say no, as long as if we're starting from scratch, it's really not an added cost.
But I think
then
they're
that's-
still going to want to know, is this on top of what we're already providing? Because that is a cost. Doesn't that make sense? That's what you were just saying.
It will add cost because it will reduce the amount of footprint that's available for the structure. If we have to
Well,
provide
But-
additional
So
exterior private.
if the commission is interested in this subject, can I suggest maybe a different approach to it, which is if you would like to task me to contact the building community and ask the question in a broad sense, to say, commission is curious about balconies and such things. Tell us what your experience is with them and what the costs associated with them are.
That sounds
And
great.
maybe just pose it in a broad way, and then they can say, we'd love to do them, but they fall apart after 5 years and the associations don't like maintaining them. Or we would do it if we could get a setback waiver of 3 feet, because that's the whole problem with them, is that whatever the issue is. How do you feel about that? It doesn't feel like the committee is really well positioned to
Fine with
answer
me.
this builder
Yeah,
question.
it was kind of a random assignment to the Affordable Housing Committee, but yeah,
So
I
if
would
you'd
love an
like
answer
to
to
task
it.
staff with that, we can reach out to some area builders who do
So
multifamily
I
housing.
would like to amend my motion to asking staff, do we need to do a motion for that?
Sure.
So I would like to make a motion that we ask staff to investigate through the building community, the impact of adding private outdoor space per unit in projects within the next 6 months.
I just ask Paul, so is there I know you have a lot on your plate. There's a
Yeah.
lot to do. Does this, in your mind, question raise to the level of things that should consume your time?
I think that's a you question. I guess what I would say is that if you are interested enough in the subject, it would be frankly less work for me to ask directly to the building community than to coordinate with the liaison for the Affordable Housing Committee to communicate it to them, to have them have a meeting, to
I
It's a
mean,
lot
Monica, are
faster
you
to just
hearing
pose
that
a
this is
question.
like this is a really important thing for
Well,
folks, or is
for
this-
pregnant women who now maybe by force cannot leave their home in February and their baby's finally sleeping and they just want to get outside and have some sunlight on their face, it's pretty important. So yes, to me, private outdoor space should not be a privilege. It should be something that everybody has. And so there's many reasons we talked about it in the past, and I can go on about it, but to me, it is a good question and something for us to know out of respect for all residents here, because we're Vermont. Everyone should have access to outside in a safe manner. So
Yeah, we did identify it as something we felt like could potentially be like an equity issue, like where, people living in multifamily houses don't have a spot where they can get some fresh air.
Not a private
Without,
spot.
yeah, a private spot. And so it
Is
did
it-
come up. We did talk about it quite a bit and then we didn't do anything with it. We said we'd ask somebody
what we
later.
did do in the general PUD is great. It's a
Well,
great-
you did it actually to all site plans. It was not just
Right,
in the
right, right,
general
right.
PUD.
Right,
It's
so
for
that's a-
all new development.
and that was a very good.
Can you
Steps.
delegate this task to somebody, Paul?
Yes, well, it was assigned to staff, so staff is
Not just you.
not just me, although this week it feels sort of like it is.
We're
just
not
kidding.
really giving you a time frame either. I mean,
I think the motion was 6 months, which is
we
plenty of
did say
time.
6 months.
Yep.
Okay, I didn't write that.
Yep.
down. 6 months.
But we still can vote on it, so it doesn't have to
Okay.
pass. I think Ted seconded it, so we can vote on.
Any other questions? I think that Andrew had a good one. Okay, all in favor of the motion? Aye. Thank you, Paul. Okay, we can move on to the next item, which is a follow-up from some feedback we've received recently.
Yeah, thank you. So one of the tasks in your work plan this year is to do check-ins on how the adopted last year regulations are doing. And so tonight we wanted to just share some experiences that we've seen with some of the environmental protection standards and some quirks in it. As we said, when we adopted the form-based code, the only thing that we're certain of is that not everything is 100% perfect. So I wanted to go through a couple of these ones. What I'm looking for broadly is just sort of general direction of, do you think that this is something that should be corrected, or is this something where the policy is what you intended it to be? So, and that gives us some homework to go with. So I was going to start with the wetlands because I think this is the most significant one that we're seeing. I'm going to bring up a map. I assume that everybody's read the packet part of it. So the issue here is that, as you know, wetlands in the city, in the residential districts, were expanded in this last set of regulations. There were two changes that were made. One is that they were expanded from 50 feet to 100 feet. And the second, which is a little bit tangential, but the opportunities for exceptions to impacts to buffer areas or to wetlands themselves were significantly reduced. A lot of the discussion, to my recollection, was about new development or about large development in site plans and things like that. What we've seen a bunch of this summer are folks who've been coming in for projects on their single family home properties and have run into this same rule. So I'm going to do a little scrolling around of the map of some different areas where we've seen this issue. A lot of neighborhoods in South Burlington in the last 25 years have been built in a way that the wetlands were excluded from the neighborhood, and the 50-foot buffer was accounted for in that exclusion. So what you see here, the lines aren't perfect, but imagine that the wetland here, this is Pinnacle at Spear, you add 50-foot buffer and you get to pretty much the back of the property lines. If you add 50 feet, which is what the new regulations have done, it goes to the backs of all these homes. So the rule now says you cannot build a structure in a wetland buffer, and so it's prohibited. There is an exception that says if something's already lawn, you can go to the DRB. However, to go to the DRB, one, you must hire a professional to have a field delineation done. It may turn out that it's even bigger at that point. And then two, you have to get on the schedule, and it's a few months out to be reviewed.
But can't you
So-
always do a field delineation, whether or not it's lawn? I'm not following that process,
Say
actually.
that again.
I mean,
In
can't,
order to go to the DRB to get an exception, you have to prove where it is.
and you can only do that if it's lawn? You're saying?
So sorry.
It has to be
Right.
field delineated.
Yeah,
Yes,
that's right.
sorry. I skipped over a part too quickly. There is one exception in our regulations to when you can impact a wetland buffer, and that's that if it's already impacted, you can make a case to the DRB that what you're doing is not going to be any worse than what's already there. It was really designed for something like a parking lot that is going to be a parking lot along Williston Road is in a wetland buffer. It's being proposed to be turned into a building. Whether it's a parking lot or a building, frankly, doesn't make it any worse. Or we had one example a couple of years ago of a swimming pool associated with a hotel was in a wetland buffer. Well, it's not really serving a lot of purpose there. So the idea was to allow for a conversion. It could theoretically also apply to a backyard, but that's not, frankly, what was in our heads when we were thinking about it.
When you say, for example, a lawn would remain a lawn. They wouldn't have to restore.
Correct. A lawn everything can stay in its current state. So if somebody there's no requirement to say that you have to, you can continue to mow your lawn. The issue that's come up that we've gotten about a dozen of so far this summer is somebody wants to expand the back deck, or they want to add a shed or something like that. And what we see is that there's a number of neighborhoods that were designed where the backyards are frankly right up against the wetlands. So here's another, this is Stonehouse Common and Cobblestone Circle, same thing over there. Village at Dorset Park has some of that same issue. And then we've got a couple that get a little more complex where this is off Allen Road. There are a handful of parcels where the house has not yet been built. And so there's an interesting sort of legal question that comes in about what happens if this wetland is now expands all the way out to here. And then a house. This is Haymaker Lane. Let me back out a little bit. This is Allen Road at the bottom here.
Yep.
Spear Street. So we got one, for example. There was a house built here last year, and they wanted to be adding a deck on the back. There's no house on this one, but we could get a request in next week for it. So, and then, here's another example right here of here's a house where part of the actual house would be in the 50-foot buffer potentially. And, keep in mind that the mapping isn't perfect here, but the issue is with 50 feet added to it, a lot of backyards and sometimes homes are now included. So my question is sort of, what are your thoughts on the intent associated with that? There's lots of ways that we could address it if it was not your intent, but if it is your intent, then we'll continue.
I know you said we talked about this in regards to the 500-year floodplain and exemptions for pre-existing structures. I mean, it seems to me like this should be a pretty easy fix on that front if we all agree on that. I mean, I don't think it was our intent to prohibit a landowner in a house that's been there for 20 years to not replace their deck or expand their deck.
10?
Well, is it just, is it just the, an accessory and a deck? Or does it also include some other structure that could have negative environmental impacts if it starts being taken out by a flood and heading downstream?
Well, so the issue specifically is the expanded wetland buffer of being not just 50 feet, but 100 feet. So
Mhm.
if it's in a river corridor or 500-year floodplain, that's regulated separately.
Right.
The question here is about having the wetland buffer, which is hopefully not very wet because it's not the wetland itself. It's 100 feet away from the wetland, where we're trying to, where the purpose of a wetland buffer is to protect the wetland itself. It's
Mhm.
not wet in and of itself. But it could be, to your question, it could be a deck or it could be a shed, but the next, and that's what we've gotten so far, but the very next question we get could be, well, the very edge of my house is now within the 50-foot buffer, and I was hoping to extend my, 100-foot buffer. I was hoping to extend my house out, add a room on the back.
That's the problem. And because therein, it would be an environmental issue. The other two issues of a deck, or a little shed, not so, but then it goes back to if the addition floods, goes into the
Also important.
basement, the boiler, that whole, that.
So it sounds like there's already in place a process for someone who wants to build the deck, as long as it's already mowed lawn or already.
Yes,
No,
but it's a
but it's-
very painful
Well,
process.
right. So to me, there's there's two different things to look at. Was our intention to protect the wetland, or the wetland with the 50 foot? Yes. Was our intention to enable someone to have a right to something that's all that they should have a right to? Was it our intention to make that very complicated? So is there a way that we can streamline for residential purposes the process, that they don't have to hire someone, they can provide perhaps with the city's help, whatever, they can provide a photograph, just like what we're showing, and demonstrate, so A, is there something we can do to just ease the process? Okay, but then the second thing that comes to me is if we're saying, oh, yeah, well, sure, they can all just do that, then what's to stop just Joe, anybody who owns a piece of property, from just mowing the whole thing and then saying, oh, well, it hasn't been a wetland, I've been mowing it, like.
Right. Well, one, the exemption for pre-existing lawns is prior to the adoption of the regulations.
Okay, so already a lawn as of a certain date.
Lawn or pavement or whatever,
Okay.
other
Okay.
things. I guess the question in terms of simplifying a process is what are the criteria of what you're expecting somebody to prove ultimately? Because, excuse me, everything right now associated with wetlands is very science-based. So you have to make a scientific argument, which means that you have to hire a scientific professional. From the staff end, I will also say that from an administrative perspective, a year ago, if somebody came in for a deck or a shed, we would say, is it in your backyard? Is it more than 5 feet from the property line? Here's your permit. It was a 10-minute project. Now it's a 2 to 3 hours of research to figure out what wetlands might be there, and then communicating with them and then explaining to them. So just from a where staff time goes with this, this is become a much larger project, just to.
So Andrea is.
But just, yeah, I mean, I think this is a complicated question, but just one thing we should keep in mind is that buffer, I think, was not necessarily to protect the wetland, but to provide habitat buffer for, right, all the wildlife that use the wetland, right? So wasn't, I think, not for the wetland itself, but like a riparian area. right, which is important.
Yeah, but also resilience for
Yeah.
major rain events.
Yeah.
So, but the impact we're talking about is restricted to the additional 50 feet.
Mhm.
So
Yeah,
maybe we
so-
should focus on that, but
Right. So, without going too deeply into solutions, if you felt that this was something you wanted to accommodate, that something could be written that said that a pre-existing lot as of X date, that the buffer is 50 feet, for example. I mean, it could be as simple as that if you chose to do it. A pre-existing lot of no more than half an acre or something like that, or an acre. Which is what you've done with the habitat blocks, is to just give a simple exemption to that. That way, it's not about new development. It's not about site plans. It could be just restricted to residential properties, that kind of thing.
But that doesn't clarify, it's a pre-existing lot and it has been mowed and therefore it does not, it's not currently field. It's not currently tall grasses, so that doesn't
Right.
really.
Well,
do
and that-
But-
right.
But, I mean.
Right,
it-
and
it
that
just-
does get difficult because when we're talking about big development or big redevelopment, they're always hiring a wetland engineer to be a wetland scientist at the beginning to study the whole thing. If we're asking somebody, whether it's staff or an applicant or a property owner, to prove this, then that's a big burden of proof that has to be proven about what was your lawn 3 years ago, what is it now? I think those are the types of sort of tricky administrative questions.
You said something about like a size limit, like I think you just said half acre lot, like, I think if we did do something, keeping that size is probably important. When you start to get into like a bigger lot, there's more options. Like you might be able to do something on the side or the front, or,
Right. So in the habitat blocks, what you said is that a pre-existing residential lot of less than an acre is not subject to the habitat block. So you don't have to, for the handful of cases where there's a few trees in the back corner of the lot, they're not subject to those rules. As a for instance.
It seems to me the challenge here is that there are quite a few properties. This is
Right.
a much bigger scale.
Yep.
And it doesn't seem fair to put a tremendous amount of burden on just new development and then just not, it'd be really nice to find a way to streamline for people, not overburden staff, but also to stick with what our intentions were.
Well, I think one of Paul's big questions is clarifying our intentions. Like, was the intention to not let someone put a shed in their pre-existing lawn? I don't know. We just didn't talk about it. So, I think maybe clarifying our intentions might be important to even start.
Do people, I don't know, I kind of feel, I guess myself, differently maybe about a deck on a pre-existing lawn than expanding a house, or even on a lot that's not built yet with no lawn, like saying we're going to waive it for that developer. I feel like, yeah, someone has a deck, they want to build a deck, expand the deck, it's not going to damage things too much, and people maybe feel like they should be able to do that, but I'm not sure that people necessarily have a right to make their house bigger if it extends into the wetland buffer. Like, I don't know, that feels like something that I can defend as, you just can't do it.
I was going to say also, it's structures that would negatively impact a wetland buffer. Something that's above ground, as Andrew just mentioned, like a deck, maybe, but an accessory dwelling or enlarging the house, that will have a much more significant impact on the wetland.
Paul, you were going to
I
say
was
something?
just gonna say, it's always been the homeowners' cry that developers can get permits to build 100 houses and I can't get a permit to put a deck in the back of my house, so I think if we can do something to make it a little easier on people, I think we'd be okay. Also, I had put an addition on my house last year, and the rules are pretty tight about what percentage of the property, can be house, and there's a lot of rules in place already. How close you can get to the the boundary between your house and the neighbor's house and lots of things.
Duncan?
I guess I'm thinking, person at Butler Farms has owned the house for 15 years. It's thought about putting a shed in the corner of the lot, suddenly can't do it. I completely respect the wetland buffer, but I think in a case like this, we're talking about small residential properties. We're not talking about major impacts to the wetland. It's been grass for the most part. It's pre-existing. So I think if we just look at, let's pick a certain size property, maybe an acre, like you said, to be consistent with what we did in the habitat blocks, and give them some sort of exemption.
For small sheds and decks or for other stuff?
I would, if they want to expand their house, it was already, their lawn went up to the wetland 10 years ago. If they want to expand their house a little bit.
Well, it went up to the 50-foot.
Yeah, all right, so it went to the, okay, so.
Anything that you choose to do, I would recommend that you keep at least the 50-foot.
No,
That's been
I'm
the standard
no,
for
I'm not
decades.
talking about that.
Yeah.
Certainly that, but I firmly believe we should give some sort of exemption for pre-existing structures there.
I would just say, sorry.
No, go ahead, Monica.
I would just say, because of the number of them though, I don't know why another developer wouldn't say, well, acreage wise, that's exactly what I'm talking about doing in my new plan here. You take that row there, put it over there. It's the same thing that I was doing. I want that exemption too.
Yeah, but that's new building, that's new development. I'm talking about pre-existing structures only.
Michael?
Pre-existing structures.
So in other words, a house in Butler Farms that was built in 1987, right,
Yeah.
on the 50-foot buffer, that's a pre-existing structure.
But would a new shed that's not attached to it be pre-existing? Like,
I'm-
no, right?
You know what, I guess my feeling is if that landowner should have the right, they had the right before we took it away, they should still have that right to do that. It's not like, as long as, they're not going to start, dam the stream and build a wading pool, but
Okay.
I firmly believe that we should have some leeway there.
Maybe there's a way, Paul, to define what can and cannot be done, but being guided by what is going to disturb the wetland. In other words, in an above ground, a deck, or maybe even a shed.
Sure. I mean, a simple way to say it
But
could be to say that
no-
nothing that has a foundation under it.
Something
And
like
then,
that. And
you could then further decide whether you want to say an expansion to a house that doesn't have a foundation or an accessory structure and decide whether that is relevant to you or not. But you
that-
could say,
whatever that is can only be in that extra 50-foot section.
right, so, right, I hear what you're saying.
That makes sense.
And I
Okay.
guess my point is just to double check that in every possible way to make sure that that cannot be picked up and used as a, but new development.
Right. Well, so we do have already a number of places where it says that in our regulations where X thing as of X date, a lot existing as of this date gets these rules. That's and I did talk with our attorney about it, and the attorney felt, that's a very, there's no problem with doing that. So I think if there's going to be that pressure, it's going to be on you all, not on us.
And by
For new
lot
development.
existing, that would mean that like a larger parcel that has not been broken into smaller lots yet, but is one big lot. They can't say, oh, my one big lot has been existing.
Right. That's why you'd put it. That's why you'd put a size limit on it
Okay.
also.
Okay.
Okay.
And then if they subdivide it in two, it's no longer that lot anymore.
Okay.
Okay, well, I'm hearing some concurrence to mock something up for you. So I will go ahead and do that.
Great.
Okay, the next one, similar, I don't need to show a map on this next one, but wetlands and city center. So you do have a few instances where you allow for impacts to buffers of wetlands if they go through all the scientific analysis that needs to be done. And the primary one of that is that you allow it in city center, that somebody can make the case following the same rules essentially as that they follow with the state. The quirk with it is that we've had this happen twice already to us, where that is the only reason a project is going to the DRB. So they're not, the DRB is not actually looking at the project itself. They're only looking at the impact to a wetland buffer. And could that happen? So from a streamlining and prioritization perspective, the question for you is, how would you feel about allowing for the scientific analysis to be administratively managed in city center for wetland buffers, consistent with the rest of the application?
And staff likes that idea.
Yes. You know, I think we would go through the same exercise. We're doing the review for the board, of course, but it's just a, if you choose not to, that's perfectly fine. But in terms of priority of development being city center, this would be a way to simplify review processes for things that are wetland buffers.
What is the DRB standard that they're being asked to?
So they are looking at whether the functions and values of the wetland are being harmed.
I can imagine the public may be interested in that.
My question is I think if it's an administrative review, will there be the opportunity for abutters and the public in general to basically a public hearing?
So
Because it gets really.
if it's a
complicated.
larger project, something over 5,000 square feet being added, then there is a requirement that there be a neighborhood meeting that the applicant hosts to discuss the project overall. And it has to be, notification has to be sent to all the abutters to do it. There's not a public hearing because it's an administrative review, but they do have to do a public meeting. The applicant does, and provide us the notes from that meeting.
Do you already have such a situation in city center?
The so the core part of city center has its wetland approvals, along Market Street. That was done several years ago, and was all the way up to the Army Corps.
Along Garden Street.
Garden Street, Market Street, that's done. We've had this exact situation happen to us now 3 times for the same property at the Hampton Holiday Inn. A corner of that property adjacent to the Windjammer has a wetland buffer on it, and they have modified their plans a couple times, and each time they modified their plans, they're modifying the way in which they're impacting the same wetland that was either lawn or a pool structure previously. But whenever they do anything to change what they previously did, they have to go back to the DRB. So that's been the tricky, is that, you know, here's a project with 75 dwelling units that's being approved administratively, but the impact to a wetland buffer has to go to the DRB.
So, but the administrative process would be a mirror image of what the DRB would do.
From a technical perspective, yes. The difference being there's no public hearing and the decision is made by the administrative officer. And then on appeal, it goes to the board.
I don't think I'd have a problem with it, but I do have a problem with it that there's no public. Public doesn't have an opportunity to weigh in on this, because it's an environmental issue which is of interest to a lot of people.
Paul, did you just say the public could appeal the administrative?
Yep, so any decision that's made by the administrative officer is appealable to the DRB.
All right, so the public would have input, it's just after the fact, not before the fact.
If
Well, and
they're
they have
after the
input because
fact.
there's a neighborhood meeting if it's impacting more than a certain amount of land. You could also put a size cap on it if you wanted. You know, if this was something the scale of all the Army Corps approvals for Garden Street, then maybe that should go to the board because it is a large one, but we're talking about like 300 square feet of the buffer of a class 2 wetland, which I think has been sort of the outsized sort of oddity of a tens of millions of dollars project, of which this tiny component is going to the DRB, but they're not seeing any other aspect of it.
Monica?
So, I mean, we made the strategic decision and it was approved and it's in the regs that city center kind of has this separate treatment. And we said the development there will override these environmental concerns. So that's there. And it seems in terms of the public, I mean, so even if the public did come forward, the regulation supports staff taking care of this and the public not necessarily knowing. And I'm not saying it's great, but we did make that that is in our regulation right now, that in city center, so that other natural resources can be left alone, we let this happen here. So I think going with staff and risking the chance of a public member not knowing about it is, at least it's consistent with what the goal was, if not perfect. But I will also say that something else that came out of the public comments that I forgot to mention was the idea of there being a permit alert system that would basically go to all committees. But, you know, I mean, every permit that's given, I think, is public information. And this may be a matter of educating the public about how they can be alerted to permits, or what they can do to regularly look for permits that are public information. And if there is a permit that does not require DRB, but they're seeing it relates to land they're concerned about, they do still have the right, and they do still have public access. So I think the city's providing public access. City center is a unique area where we made that decision. That maybe can be revisited, but I think for those two reasons, I support staff taking this on if that's what they want to do, and not sending it to the DRB.
Michael?
Yeah,
Go ahead.
I mean, yes, we, in form-based code, if a project is in full compliance, it's an administrative decision. If a project isn't in full compliance with form-based code, then it has to go somewhere else, because the administrator would have to decline because it's not in compliance. So those would have to go to the DRB.
Can I just clarify? So that's why I asked Paul the question about the role of the DRB. The role of the DRB is to determine whether or not the impact to the wetland is meaningful, I mean, that's in the regs now. So I'm not following what you're saying, Monica, that the decision was made not to protect the resources of the city center, when the DRB has been given this role to do exactly that.
Can I characterize it slightly differently
Yeah,
to say
sure.
that in the last round of amendments, the planning commission decided to augment the wetland protections everywhere outside of city center. So everywhere else, the bar was raised to say, basically, with very few exceptions, you can't touch a wetland buffer. In city center, the prior standards were retained, which are still standards. It still has to get state wetland approval, and it still has to get local review. So it's not a diminishment of rules. It's just not an augmentation in the way that
Right, but there's
everywhere
no
else.
intent to kind of waive the environmental rules in city center.
Oh, yeah, no,
Right,
I think she was
so-
just saying we didn't put that like extra,
We didn't
oomph.
increase them, but
Right,
we didn't,
yeah.
there was no intent to decrease them either. So,
Right. And I guess what I'd say as a practical
Right.
matter, when the DRB reviews in this circumstance where the standards are essentially the same as the state standards, in practice, after the state has performed their review and has done their analysis, the board follows in line with the state's decision, because they have wetland scientists reviewing this as their career. And so moving this administratively doesn't really change a lot in that
say the
aspect.
public is very interested in wetlands. I don't know. Seems like the existing process is useful.
There's a lot of land. There are a lot of resources in city center that did not get the improvements assigned to them. It's because we kept that land available here. So I understand why the public might in certain circumstances be upset about some impact that they would see. I got it.
So one of the things that, I think Paul brought up, like, so if the state and federal wetland reviewers review the impact, make a decision on the impact, is the DRB going to somehow come up with like different expertise as part of their project based on like neighbors' inputs, or like what?
Well, it's
I
very
guess I just want
interesting.
to make
Sometimes
sure I'm
there's,
understanding.
a
It
way
could.
to do a study of a wetland that contradicts someone else's study of a wetland, for instance. I think we've all seen that happen. And the public or a neighbor may want to have the opportunity to bring in that contrasting study.
But they can still do that.
Very limited, very limited. I mean, if it's administrative and it's just neighbors, it's very hard, as someone in the public to be so clued in to know to join that meeting to do that.
Duncan?
Paul, getting back to something you said earlier, is there right now over a certain size, a project would automatically have to go to the DRB? Is that what you were saying earlier? Is
In
it-
this,
in the form-based code district?
no, over a certain size, there has to be a neighborhood meeting. There is no size threshold for going to the DRB. So nothing goes to the DRB unless it's a subdivision or, in this case, a wetland impact.
I'm just thinking if there was a way to keep the larger projects going to the DRB, but maybe the smaller ones.
Well, I mean,
I-
you could put a cap on the amount. And I'm not, in the end, if you choose that this is not a priority, that's perfectly fine. The example that was our case study here was right here. So this is the old Holiday Inn. So it was the wetland buffer goes to sort of here-ish. And that's what's had to go to the DRB was review of the impact in sort of the buffer kind of does a little circle like that. But in trying to meet the form-based code, it's hard to sort of go around a little bubble, I guess. So
Okay, well, it sounds like there's maybe some mixed opinions on this one.
Okay.
I don't know.
Certainly was the whole sort of benefit of the form-based code, that if you're in compliance, administrator does the approval. If you're not in compliance, the administrator also cannot. Therefore, it would have to go.
So how about this? If we take this example, rather than it being size of project, what if it's something like X percent of footprint ends up having to invade? Is there like, okay, if it's less than 10% of your overall, finding scale that way? Because like what you just showed us is the benefit of form-based code is to keep it streamlined. And if it's, that piece that they need to work with, but if they were coming in and kind of taking over a whole piece, that would need to go to the DRB or I don't know.
Well, I think
Can you
Paul
show where they want to encroach?
also has his hand up then too, after Paul shows us
well,
where
it's
we're talking about.
essentially this is sort of a lawn area, and it's to have a building line be straight like that, essentially.
So to
And
take the
to be clear,
lawn
they've
to-
already got their approvals, so this is not one of asking prospectively. But as
That's the
I said,
one,
the
Jim.
quirky
That's the
thing
one.
is that they changed their
Yeah.
plans twice. And so their administrative review went through twice, but that also meant going to the DRB twice because it's any change to an impact is a review by a DRB. It doesn't matter whether it was already approved to be impacted, now it's a different approval.
Paul Ingles?
The major problem with city center is it is a wetland to begin with, and so much of it is wetland. I know we were not able to recommend any underground parking because you can go down 6 feet and it's all water, so.
And they're still doing it. the
Are they
underground
doing
parking.
underground
They've got
parking?
A lot of pumps.
Yeah.
Gosh. Mike, if Andrew, sorry.
And maybe to give some, it could be if the administrative officer determines impact is de minimis. And that's appealable itself, but if it's de minimis, then it doesn't need DRB review.
And you set what that is, or
We could, or we could just leave it to the discretion of the administrative officer to determine when the impact is de minimis.
staff can ponder, do they like that, or do they want a number? Yeah. because I agree. That's,
This feels
Yeah.
de minimis to me.
Yeah, an existing lawn
Yeah.
turning
Right.
to, you know, okay.
Make a line.
Well, and something that you do outside of city center is there's a provision that says that anything that is administrative review, not city center, but anything else, at the discretion of the administrative officer can send it to the DRB. And so this is something that we could certainly keep for the wetlands. If, in the opinion of the administrative officer, it should go to the DRB, it goes to the DRB.
There needs to be a standard there, though.
Right, well, it's essentially the de minimis.
Yeah. If the opinion of the administrative officer is not de minimis, then it goes to DRB. I mean, that could be
yep, I like
a
that.
way to do it.
Yep. I know, I'm gonna go
Okay,
home
well,
and write that
and
down. De
maybe,
minimis, de
maybe they'll come back to
minimis.
us and
For those of
ask
us
for
who didn't go to
numbers or
law school,
something.
That's you on the tune.
It's de minimis.
Explanation?
So would we need the city attorney to give us a definition of de minimis?
We can look at it. It is a term that is already granted to the administrative officer in certain parts of state law, telecommunication facilities. I'm not an attorney, but I'm going to say in layperson's terms, the level of impact that the average person would consider to be
Very small.
very small and insignificant. Is that a fair
That's what I would
layperson's
have.
description of it?
Okay.
Okay, are you okay if I mock up something that along those
Mhm.
lines? Okay.
Please.
Types of
Big
steep
de minimis.
slopes. So this is an interesting one that recently came up. So you have now steep slope standards that say that you have to be protective of slopes that are 15 to 25%, and that for all intents and purposes, you can't touch more than 25%. We have a few properties in the city where that 25% is entirely a human-made construction. So I'm thinking of the Maple Leaf Motel on Shelburne Road. Behind it, there's a big steep drop off. This is something I had talked with Kelsey about before she left, and she said that in her experience in New Hampshire, oftentimes communities distinguish between naturally occurring steep slopes and ones that are constructed steep slopes, that if it was sort of an engineered thing, it's not necessarily trying to protect that same thing. And so the idea here would be maybe that we define steep slopes as being naturally occurring, as opposed to, like I said, behind the Maple Leaf Motel, where it's just basically we're precluding redevelopment of that property to a certain extent because there's they built it up on one side of it 45 years ago.
Interesting. Yep.
What's
Andrew?
the purpose of the steep slope protection? Is that for erosion? Like, what's the,
That's a really good question, Andrew. So our consultant who helped us to put all this together, Sharon Murray, saw steep slopes as a hazard, essentially. And she proposed a few different versions of language that in her experience, and I will say that she's based out of Bolton, which is everything is very, very, very steep, that certain slopes over a certain percentage shouldn't be impacted. That's the viewpoint. It got put into natural resource protections, but it's not necessarily about a natural resource because it's about a grade of slope.
hazard to whom? I guess I'm not understanding.
A potential hazard if not properly managed when developed. It could be an erosion issue, it could be that kind of thing. That said, you have put in standards now that say in 15 to 25%, they have to have a geotechnical engineer demonstrate that they're being safe with it. You could just apply that number 15% plus and not have the 25% plus standard at all. You could just say, you could, yeah.
I think that's something Ted had recommended when we were discussing it. I don't know if you still had any thoughts on that, Ted. I think Ted had recommended maybe even removing the steep slopes back at the beginning and just having the erosion standard applied.
Yeah, I mean, it was really more, it was determined that it was not environmentally destructive, you know, as a steep slope where there's a stream, but Maple Leaf Hotel, the steep slope goes into a parking lot. So I'm not quite sure if that,
Well-
has any implications to the environment.
There were some examples that came to us before that demonstrated that if parking had to be in the rear of a building and it was on a steep slope, I just remember seeing photographs of the destruction to the slope in order to fit. Yeah. O'Brien, yeah. Yeah, but it really destroyed a lot of land to create the horizontal that was needed of the slope. So I think it's both the water protection and then looking at protecting the amount of land on that slope.
And then I think the connected discussion to that, to your point, Andrew, is you do have river corridor standards. You do have now habitat blocks, which are the large forested areas. You do have wetland standards together. So I'm showing example, an area of city center. You see a lot of really steep slopes there, but all of that is also in your habitat block, and all of that is also in your wetland and riparian buffers. So even without a steep slope, none of that would be able to be touched.
But then what's the case for distinguishing between naturally occurring and non-naturally occurring, if it's about erosion or safety or removal? Like, I mean, the reg should be driven by the purpose, right?
I guess if I were to try to make that case, and I'm not trying to make the case, but if I did try to make the case, I would say that a naturally occurring slope has its own the manner in which erosion is taken care of is, as it has been for hundreds and thousands of years. In a constructed slope, it's somebody 45 years ago who had an idea about how to do it, and that's not necessarily any better than somebody having an idea this year. But I'm not trying to sell the argument. I'm just trying to answer your question.
I'm certainly sympathetic to the motel. I mean, being able to improve and do something with this slope, but just trying to draw a principled policy is.
Well, it also gets to what Michael was talking about earlier about like altering our underlying geology. Like if we have such a steep slope that we need to do such drastic amounts of altering of our land to use it, do we really want them to be doing that? And I think that's what Monica was getting at too. Like if it's so steep, it's just possibly so difficult to develop. You're doing so much changing. It's maybe more impact than we want them to have. But in the case where somebody built a berm to keep traffic lights off their house, or they filled out behind their area, you know, it kind of feels like if they're going to do improvements to their existing man-made steep slope, like, do we really want to keep them from doing that? It might be a hazardous situation, just that they built something in a bad way. I don't know.
I have an example that affects me, which is when Heatherfield was built, they removed all the trees that provided the soundproofing from the highway for two developments, Indian Creek and Woodbury Island. So they built a berm on the north side of the property, which goes down to the highway. It didn't do a hell of a lot, but it's for sound interruption, if you like, noise interruption for the new development and the old ones. So altering that or removing it would have quite a big impact on the communities, those three communities, for sure. I don't know whether wildlife has now also adapted and invaded it, because the area of Heatherfield was a huge wildlife reservoir. Totally wild, 45 acres.
Now, in that instance, of course, Michael, it is owned by the association, and so they would themselves have to make the decision that they wanted to remove those sound barriers.
Assuming it's owned by them,
So,
yes.
that seems unlikely that they would do that, but I hear your point.
I mean, yes, but
So
I find Jessica's comment more compelling, that making major alterations to a naturally occurring steep slope, it would be problematic for me.
Duncan?
No, I seem to remember we did talk about steep slopes in the context of places where we, for that exact reason, we did not want to see development. So I don't know that I would be on board if we were to take them out, but certainly, not constructed ones, that's a different issue. I don't know if we put a size barrier in there. Yeah, I don't know. But that, to me, those are two different things. I would.
So it sounds like maybe keep the standard in general, but have it not apply to a man-made steep slope.
A human-made?
Theme, kind of a general direction.
I've been very careful to use the word constructed.
I know.
No.
I've been very, very careful.
I'm
Made.
sorry. I've, yeah,
Old habits die hard.
But they will die.
yes.
Okay, that sounded like some concurrence there. So the next thing on steep slopes is this is a state map. We actually have better mapping, though it crashes our system every time we use it, because the data is so good that we get every 1 foot of elevation change. The problem with having really good data is that it creates problems. So you can get little tiny spots of a steep slope everywhere. And so this is a question I posed to Taylor at the Regional Planning Commission, who helped us to draft this. And he said, I think that the best thing that you could do would be to run a GIS analysis, sort of like this map, and then manually just take out all the little tiny itty bitty ones and say the map that you're that you're showing is the steep slope map, rather than to have an argument take back and forth of like, oh, something the size of that desk is in the middle of that parcel and it's a steep slope, so you can't put the building
Paul,
there.
you can't like put a parameter into that mapping that says if it's a minimum drop of 3 foot, 5 foot,
So
10
we do
foot.
say 3 foot drop, but you can still have little like,
Right, but is the problem the mapping or is the problem in the 3 foot? Like maybe it should be 5 foot or
right, so
10 foot.
that was the way I posed the question was, is there a best practice about, should it be 5 feet? Should it be 7 feet? Should it be a minimum area of blank? And what they came back to me with was the best thing might be to just decide what you feel is important as a city and then map it and show it, rather than to try to mathematically get ourselves out of the problem.
Well, we might need to do both. Like, would we need to do both? Because what you're saying is we could have the map and then we have the field study. So it feels like we need the map and the field study to have
Right, well, the
some
field
kind of
study could be somebody
criteria.
proving that,
Well, I'm just, I mean, 3
yeah.
feet actually sounds like teeny,
right,
mean,
it's
it-
very small.
right? I mean, it's
It's
just.
here
I-
to the, it's here to the floor.
And what exactly does that mean? Like 3 feet, 3 feet from bottom to rise?
Right,
so
so it
that if
means
it's a
that the slope is
25% slope,
25% for,
So you may have like a 10-foot ramp,
Mhm.
but 3 feet from bottom to rise. Is that what
Right.
that means?
right, which isn't, it's steep, but it's not that steep.
Couldn't we?
I have a comment about the
Monica
map.
and then
Yeah,
Michael.
what's
Yeah.
very exciting about this map, and I wish that I saw this back when we were doing our stuff. I'm seeing connectivity here on these slopes. I mean, these slopes, and I know one in particular that goes along the east side of Wheelock Farm there. Remember, I was saying that area, can't that be a connector? And Arrowwood was like, no, that's not a connector. But I know that in that steep slope area, there is a tremendous amount of wildlife. So whatever we do, I think the definition and the even if it's small, like if you look at if you go back to that one, Paul, and you continue north, and then you see that one little blip there. But go down to the, no. If you go above the red, here's the red.
Yep.
Go to the red, and then just hit that one right there. See, there's that little island. If you look at it in isolation, it might be like, oh, that's just but when you look big picture, there is a thread of connectivity. And I bet we would find that because when you're looking at this map, there is a plan. There is
Right.
a
Well, so the scale of what I was trying to represent, I'm sorry that the data was just crashing, is way smaller than anything on here. It's the problem is we can see 1 foot changes. You can see in old data, the old racetrack that used to exist over here, because you can see the tiny little depression in the land. So it records everything, which then means that there's a burden of proof that has to go through every application of proving, is it 3 feet? Is it not 3 feet? It It hasn't happened yet, but I'm waiting for the day where this becomes a really big challenge.
Well, so I guess my comment is simply, it may not, to me, it may not be the number of feet. It is there connectivity to it? And if it's completely isolated, even if it's larger, like if you go into the condo development there and there's that one yellow island, like,
Right. Well, and our subdivision standards do talk about identifying prominent features, ridge lines, things like that, like landscape features. So it is looked at from that perspective. This is really about the where can you not build? Because in the red, it's a no touch area.
well, right. So I wonder if something that's isolated, like those two islands, the two yellow islands within the development, to the connectivity to me that the steep slopes create or what the value are. And if, like, to Andrew's point about purpose, I mean, that relates directly to the purpose, but something that's clearly isolated and wouldn't connect no matter the size, generally, I mean, within reason, would seem to be less significant. So my offer is to find a way to tie connectivity to it like we did with our other maps. And if it's not within a connected route, which you can see, then it can be looked at differently regardless of the size. So
Paul Ingalls?
Paul, are you mapping the entire city with LiDAR?
So the whole state's been done with LiDAR at this point. So
Wow.
it is fascinating to see what's been uncovered. And this is one place where it creates an interesting problem.
Yeah,
Data being too good.
archaeologists use it to discover ancient civilizations. It's cool stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah.
probably not
Do you
ancient
think there's
size.
maybe like a hybrid here, like of, Andrew had suggested, maybe 3 feet's too low, maybe it should be 5 feet, and maybe there's a square footage less than
Let me
500
check in
square
with the
feet,
mapping
or,
folks,
maybe.
see if there's some kind of hybrid. What I'd really love to do, so projects that are big projects that go to the DRB are already going through a big analysis, a little bit like our issues that we were talking about before with the wetlands. Each little blip that's in a backyard then means a big administrative project. And so if there's a way to sort of screen out the really small ones up front so that it doesn't have to be proven at the time of application, make everybody's lives a lot easier.
So these steep slopes are delineated now. Isn't there a mathematical solution to this, that if these portions of this steep slope, which are 3 feet or less, can't be more, can't exceed a certain percentage of the total area of the slope? I think I'm not doing the math
Let me
right.
see what I can do. I think that the interesting technical
could
challenge is
eliminate
that
those.
the data is better than the computing power. So when Melanie was helping us to do this, it was crashing her computer every time she tried to manipulate it. So that's
So if
but-
it's less than X percentage of the area, then don't
Yeah.
consider it.
And if it's not connected, close by to a larger path.
It sounds like there's general interest in this idea of simplifying it with
let's
like
think on that a little bit.
easy map.
But I love that map. I wish that was one of our layers. I miss our layers.
We're working
I
on it.
know, but
Okay.
And then the last one I think you've already talked about today, which is environmental restoration projects. So I think we've already got guidance on that of look for opportunities where if it's truly an environmental restoration project to simplify the process.
Great.
Amen.
can I ask a question on that?
Sure.
Sorry, just this is off track, but I've been asked and I keep forgetting to answer. With our water systems, we've already discussed putting on the open fencing so animals can cross through. And I also thought separately, we have an ordinance about not using metal chain link fence. And so this is really coming out of the blue, but top of Allen Road at Spear, where the new bike path sidewalk was built, there is a chain link fence put in by the city.
The
And I-
chain link fence prohibition is in the southeast quadrant.
Oh, and that's not Southeast Quadrant.
not
So
Southeast
that
Quadrant.
chain link fence is gonna stay there on Allen Road. Sorry, this
I
is
mean,
really,
my guess is that if it was built last year, unless there's a specific request
okay,
through the council to remove it.
okay.
We
So the
wouldn't
chain link
likely be.
fence thing is only in the SEQ.
Yeah.
Well, and then also if it's in our right of way, typically projects in the right of way are not subject to local regulations. That becomes a policy question, but
Okay, so we can move on to item 7, which is the Economic Development Committee ask here.
so I haven't written up an actual request, and I think in this case, I would recommend that you make an actual request of them, like in writing. But I wanted to get your take on it, of whether this is something that you would like to task to them. They were excited to take it on this past year. They took it out of their next year work plan, but I understand only because they thought maybe they weren't going to be tasked it with you guys. So I think if you were to task it, they would be very interested, but they don't want to work on it if you're not interested in the subject. So from my view, as I said, there's a couple of key issues. One is subjects like what the folks at On Logic brought forward, which is what kind of ancillary activities should be allowed, what kind of processes outside of environmental protection standards should be done to support business growth in those areas. And at the same time, what uses, if any, still need to be separated from people, and how much should the city be thinking about a policy of some areas that say this is only for heavy industrial use, i.e. it can't be an office building that goes in there. We need to reserve a handful of spaces where there are going to be big trucks, because we are certainly running out of spaces. So that's the broad question. And then the last thing I would say is, and then I would put it through the rubric of the same policy priorities that you're thinking about for the plan as a whole, so that it is being thought of in a way that is supporting business growth and doing so through a lens of clean and green and climate action oriented and et cetera, that it's not separate from those. It's contained within that subject.
Now, this wouldn't include the U-Mall, right?
No, I'm really thinking about Meadowland,
Park.
Tech Park, Tilly Drive, Gregory Drive, behind the airport, Burrard Drive over by where Pizza Putt used to be. Those kinds of sort of industrial areas, well, industrial
Mhm.
or
Yeah.
business areas.
I'd say yes. Short answer, yes.
Yeah, I'd be comfortable with it, provided the brief or the statement of work that we're asking of them is very, very clear and no ambiguities.
Okay, would you be willing to let me write up a scope of work
Yeah.
for you to approve and share to them?
Yeah.
Should we be asking them though to work, say, together with the Natural Resources Committee so that in coming up with their recommendations, they also think about balancing the current environmental qualities of those areas?
I think that, and correct me if I'm wrong, folks, but my understanding of the way it would be tasked is that the environmental protection standards would not be part of this discussion. That the standards that you put in about habitat blocks and wetlands and river corridors and floodplains, that you're comfortable with that, but that there's all sorts of other things about how these properties are developed that would be welcomed.
Right, but there were some things that were not like talked about, but not acted on, right? Like meadows and
That's right.
farmlands and other resources that some of these areas probably contain.
They do. There's significant grasslands.
Yeah.
In two of them at least.
Can I have
I think that's a hard question to ask the Economic
that's-
Development
No,
Committee.
I
feel
know,
like-
but if their
not economic
report or their recommendation is a joint one, say, with the Natural Resource Committee, then there'd be more likelihood that there's kind of a balanced assessment of those areas.
Can I add to that? Andrew, I actually had an exact same thought, but mine was relating to the Affordable Housing Committee. And then saying, if the idea is to talk about, should these lands be kept as specifically this, or should it go to multi-use or whatever else? Wouldn't it be great to ask the Affordable Housing Committee to weigh in also? And then I realized, you know what? No, because we need to start in one very focused area and then take it from there. So I think the ask of the Economic Development Committee should be very focused on
Economic
their concern. And then when we have their feedback, we layer in all of those other aspects. That's so I did not ask if it should include the Affordable Housing Committee. And maybe that also gives support to it not including other committees.
I would ask Paul that they be specifically required to take into account and evaluate the existing natural resources in these areas that they're going to look at.
Yeah,
in the
I mean, I
industrial
think
areas,
at
because
it- right.
Meadowland has significant grasslands, and adjacent to Tilly Drive, I believe there's a big, I believe it's Pizzagalli property, but it's a huge grassland. So environmentally and from a
Yeah,
climate.
I mean, I guess I
standpoint,
I
maybe-
agree. And I would also say to Monica, to your point, the thing that's in the back of my mind is transportation is also a critical
Exactly.
component, because if we're going to meet any of our climate goals, we've got to figure out how to reduce vehicle miles traveled, and those areas are big drivers of it. But my broad thought with this was, as you're going to be doing with the comprehensive plan, to provide some overarching guidance of the lens through which you're asking folks to look at these issues. So look at them from a climate and natural resource viewpoint and from a transportation viewpoint. So it's not just without guidance, that there is parameters that are, and you can say, and affordability, and that we're open to ideas around how does this support not just the business growth, but the
I guess I'm
business
just not
concern.
sure why we would want to solely focus here on economic development of these areas. Maybe we should do that in parallel with, ideas about further conservation.
Because they're currently the IO areas.
Yeah,
Yes.
they're areas that we have designated for economic development.
Yeah.
I understand the
I
natural
always pretty
concerns,
limited
but
on what you can do, right?
I would agree with what Monica said. Let's ask very detailed ask, and then we can get the information back and filter it, as we need.
Pretty sure that if the members of the Economic Development Committee talk to the incumbents in these industrial areas, they're going to come back with, I'm pretty sure, with a recommendation or a request for workforce housing within
Mhm.
the areas.
Yeah, and I think it's up to us to make sure that we're considering all the other things too. Like, if, I think they might say it's important to have areas for these different things. And then it's up to us to say it's also important to have areas for meadows. Like, I don't know that that's something they need to weigh in on. Like, I think
no,
that's
that's
for
what I was
us to kind of
suggesting,
put
the-
everything in perspective after we have their
Right,
information.
but do we need help on that front too, if we're gonna focus on more development and industry? Shouldn't we balance that with the folks that are articulating, the importance of conserving that land?
I don't know that we're asking them about more. I think we're asking them about different, because there's already marks on where there cannot be development, right? I think the question, and so in discussing what the specific ask is, and it says here, are there things that you're not permitted to do, not in terms of where to build, but the types of things to build, I mean, you're not, like, can it really not have a coffee shop that other people can use? Like, I don't know what things are not permitted right now that wouldn't necessarily change the footprint or anything else, but it just changes the uses. That's how I see their ask.
I guess, Andrew, to address your concern, I mean, Article 12 still applies to these lands.
know,
It's
but-
not but I think that's going to be in the context of how they look at it too. I mean, they're going to know that.
I know that, Duncan, but I think our Article 12 also intentionally didn't address some resources that I at least think are important.
Okay, well, it sounds like it might be helpful to have kind of something for us to respond to directly, and then we can kind of ongoing continue to figure out like how we're addressing those other resources.
I mean, I appreciate that, you know, none of these conversations can happen in isolation, and that's the challenge. I think that, you know, ultimately it's a big policy question about if you're talking about areas that are not built today, whether they should be allowed to be built on or not. That's a question. A separate question is in areas that are either already built or that you have decided are good for building, what are the rules that should apply to those places? And I guess I was thinking a little bit more of the latter, but if I were the Economic Development Committee, I'd also want to know what's the palette I'm working with. If we're talking about reserving areas for industrial, are we talking about, we've got 2,000 acres or we got 200 acres? And that's going to have to be an iterative discussion. And that's the whole reason you have a comprehensive plan.
Yeah.
So, you know,
Well, and it'll
Yeah.
also be interesting because there is this whole like, okay, we're just getting out of COVID now. And so everyone's not interested in going into office buildings. But strategically, should we still make sure there is land where we're not meshing in a lot of workforce housing and whatever else? I mean, that's what it is currently
well,
doing
and
now.
there
And
has
those are
been really
important
strong demand
questions.
the last few years, the last couple of years since COVID on the manufacturing side of things, like the On-Logics of the world,
Mhm.
where it's, you know, it's in person because it's not office space, it's
Right.
building stuff.
Yeah,
So,
yeah. And we need to, yeah.
okay.
One quick question, sorry, not to belabor, but how creative, I mean, I don't know who the people are now. It's a new committee evidently. And I don't know who the staff is, but are they able to draw from examples? I know Monica's always coming up, which is great, of things in Norway, or things that she's read about. There's all kinds of things happening out beyond.
Yeah, so my
well,
starting point for them, Ted, will be I have a subscription to something called Zoning Practice, which is exactly as exciting as it sounds. But it is they have case study reports, and I think I give one to the members of the Climate Action Committee a few weeks ago. They have one on best practices and what's the evolution of business parks and industrial areas.
Oh, good.
It's a really good starting point, and the whole point of it is here's the best 12 case studies from around the country on this. So
And I was trying to find this article that I thought that I just sent it to Paul, but it was called The Future of Suburban Office Parks. The Lonely Last Days of the Suburban Office Park. It's directly relevant to this. So I just forwarded it to Duncan and Jessica, maybe. I don't know who can see their city email. I still can't see it. So I'm forgive if I know. I think so.
I can't get it on my iPad, but I can get it everywhere else. So.
Huh, okay, well, please, I can send any of you who are having troubles using your city email. Our IT folks are very interested in solving this problem. So
Right. So if you want to look it up, it's a New York Times article called Lonely Last Days in the Suburban Office Park. And it's fantastic.
So I guess just as a point of note, like sometimes people send a link to something like the New York Times. Like I don't have a subscription, so I can't usually open just a
You can
link.
always click on the cached version in Google and see it.
Okay, cached
There you
version
go.
in
Andy's
Google.
getting around.
I didn't know if other people
Around it.
had the same issue, or if there's a way to like print a PDF and or something. I don't know.
I think, yeah, if you save it and then.
Yeah.
I often just copy it and put it into a Word document and then save it as a PDF.
Get that with the
I know
wallpaper
that's
all the
helpful
time.
when you do that.
Yeah, they're really
So next is jeez, it's late.
Minutes?
Move to
Meeting
approve.
minutes from
May
May
21st.
May
4th.
24th.
Ted and I already got it.
Move to
Do-
approve, May 24th.
Okay, good. And any discussion? Okay, all in favor of approval? Alright.
Aye.
Okay, so Michael is maybe abstaining?
Yeah.
Okay, 6-1 abstention. Okay, other business, we had a few items here just to bring to people's attention in case someone wanted to talk about one of these. Okay, number C is our normal meeting day, July 26th, is when we're going to target to talk with the council about.
And council is
Um,
affirming whether they can go. We have at least one counselor who cannot attend, so we're gonna have to, and I know that Duncan's out of town and Andrew might be able to participate remotely.
Jersey, I will try.
So I guess we'll have to see if that winds up sticking as the day or not.
Would that be our next get together?
Yes.
Okay. Is there anything anyone wants to talk about before the joint meeting, just in case it is the next one?
Well, what is your thought on the topics?
So the main topic, really the topic is, as you talked about at May 24th, the top sort of goals, vision, values of the comprehensive plan. You've had a conversation, they haven't. We were going to take some of what you wrote and shared as some ideas for the meeting. Basically, a lot of similar primary goals, but maybe a little more supercharged, I guess is how I would describe it as. And these goals, these values are really sort of in our view, sort of critical to the rest of the plan of this is the rubric through which everything else is looked at for the next year. And also then becomes, if you look at the council's policy priorities, they're organized by the top 4 major policy goals in the city. So they become the goals really for the next decade of making sure that right now they're affordable and community strong, they are clean and green, they're opportunity oriented, and they're walkable. Those are the 4 big ones. So it's really sort of honing in on that topic and making sure that the council and the commission feel really good about that, whatever comes out of that as being your driving mission for the next several years.
Were any of, were the draft drafts that we've already done discussed last night or included in last night's discussion?
No, last night was entirely about, last night was under the current plan. So it was the last year of the work plan under the 2016 plan. So everything's organized by the current plan. Next year would be under the new plan.
Is there a redraft of what we had looked at? Because there
gonna
were
share it.
lots of, yeah.
Yeah, I was going to share
ideas.
that together.
Okay.
Frankly, I didn't want to be too much in the place of the council, that the commission has sort of settled on exactly what they're going to do. And then councilors might have a different idea. And then it becomes sort of a, instead of a dialogue, it becomes a debate. So we wanted to foster it to be a good dialogue.
Okay, anything else? Okay, we are adjourned.
Thanks, sir.
Thanks, everyone.
I should tell you that I'm going to be in another country 9,000 miles away between August the 14th and September the 16th. And it will be very hard for me to participate because of the